Good morning. Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology. I'm TravisShaddox. It is, what morning is it? It's June 10th, 2024. This channel, we try to figure out how we know what we know about turfgrass science, but every now and then we have a member who makes a request, and every now and then I'm able to fulfill that request. So we're going to have a guest on today. Real quick before I forget, I was going to try to do another show tomorrow morning for the guests or for the members only. Can't do it. I'm sorry. I got family obligations. I wasn't able to kind of work through that schedule. So the next episode will be back on Thursday evening, where we will be doing relatively detailed fertilizer formulations. But today, we're going to be talking about a system that I know very little about, but I know a friend who knows a lot about it. That is Dr. Gregg Munshaw. Gregg, how are you?
I am good, Dr. Shaddox. Good to see you.
Sounds weird. You call me Dr. Shaddox, but that's okay. So I'm very happy and honored to be able to call Gregg a friend. Gregg, you're probably the nicest and simultaneously the toughest turfgrass scientist I know. And you know what? You know why that is.
Well, so all Canadians are nice though, right? So
yeah. But
just how we are.
But not all Canadians, block, 150-mile-an-hour pucks coming at them from when they're almost 50 years old. So you come in one day and your arm's all black. I'm like, what the heck happened? Oh, the puck got through my pad. I'm like, what are you doing? Doesn't that hurt? And you're like, oh, nah. That's tough. That's tough.
Maybe a wee bit, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, it's going to be a little different for me because I have guests on, but I don't usually have guests on that I am friends with, so it's going to be different for me. But Gregg, since I already know you, but not everybody in the audience might know you, want to give everybody a once over on, a little bit about where you're from and how you got into the turfgrass industry?
Sure. So I grew up in Western Canada, surrounded by acres and acres and acres and acres of wheat, but didn't grow up on a farm. And so even though I was exposed early to agriculture, I certainly didn't work in agriculture until I got to college, and played sports all through high school. Never dawned on me that somebody is paid to manage these fields. And once I got to college, I wasn't really sure. I tried several different majors out, but took a summer job on a golf course, and within literally days I was like, wow, this is the life, this is fantastic. And talking to my bosses, they had gone to school for turfgrass management, and I was like, wow, you can do that. And so decided that's what I wanted to do, and so looked around for programs to go to, and ended up going to the University of Kentucky to finish out my bachelor's degree. And once I got close to finishing up, I just, I still felt like there was so much that I didn't know. And I still am that way today. There's so much I don't know. I still want to learn and figure out new things. And, why does this happen? So at that time, I decided to get into a master's program and continued on at the University of Kentucky, and then continued on for a PhD at Virginia Tech. And then went off to the academic world and was a professor for nearly 2 decades. And the reason that Travis and I can call each other friends is that we overlapped as faculty members at the University of Kentucky for a couple of years before I transitioned into what I'm currently doing. And that is, I live on a farm, and I have research plots literally surrounding me at all times, which is good and bad. You never get to shut it off, but you also get to see minute changes when things happen. And so it's a pretty cool world that I'm living in currently, where we're testing products, we're testing new grasses. We're doing some of our own research where we're, come up with an idea, and just like in my university days, we'll test things out just for the sake of, what happens, No, this is not to try and test something for some company or whatever. This is just us trying to figure out, what happens if we do this. So it's been an interesting 4 years since I left university life and have settled into this role of private research, and it's been neat.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about just have a question, or you have a curiosity, or you make an observation basically and you want to test it, and then you go out and you test it, even though it's not funded. I wonder what the percentage is of publications that come out that are a result of that, because no one's going to pay me to do research on their fertilizer that shows that their fertilizer doesn't work, but we still have to do research that benefits, the turfgrass industry as a whole, not just the funder. And, but it's hard to kind of get enough resources. You got to pay people, you got to buy equipment, you got to buy instruments, and you got to, there's pay for grad students and publication fees. There's all this stuff, and you got to fund it and pay for it somehow, but you still have questions that aren't funded, So I find myself in the same boat where there's a lot of questions I have, but no one's going to pay for that. So I got to figure out how to pay for it and how to fund it. I'm doing a project out here right now. No one's going to pay for that. Maybe like an environmental group or something might do something like that, but no industry rep or any, it's going to pay for me to produce evidence that shows that, their system doesn't work like they think it works, and so forth. So it's interesting you say that. I think a lot of turf scientists fall into that category where they're doing research on the outside of the funded, objectives, because it's just a question they would like to have answered, So.
Yeah. And a lot of the other stuff pays for you to have that ability to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're lucky, you have a little bit of donations in your program and you have some funds left over, and you can pay for those things. That's always good. And it's in living on the research centers. It's always, I think it's good, but there's always, disadvantages. Like in Fort Lauderdale, I lived like 6 blocks from the research center. So I enjoyed that because I could always go over there, take a look. I was, make sure I always had eyes on turf, daily, multiple times in the day. But then you never really get away from it, mentally you're always there. So it's like a superintendent,
Well, and I have to gripe at my kids if they're on plots, and we've got a faux cemetery in our front lawn where it looks like a bunch of headstones that have markings on them. We're measuring how slow grass grows.
Oh.
And so, looks like a cemetery because it's kind of a cemetery experiment, but my wife hates it. And so, that's one of the things about turning your lawn and surrounding land into research is that, well, maybe it doesn't look like the neighbor's place so much, but, it is what it is.
You mean you're simulating a cemetery? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So we've got wooden headstones that we have markings on, and we measure how many days it takes the grass to get to that marking on the headstone, and then mow it back down. Yeah. And so they're just permanently there.
That's a very unique turf management system that I don't know if a lot of people think about, but the acres and acres of these massive cemeteries have to be maintained, and you can't just ignore them for 2 weeks. I mean, there's, it's obviously a very delicate location, and, people are grieving and so forth, and it needs to be maintained. But wow, the maintenance and the detail and the weed eating and the edging, and there's a lot.
String trimming, all around the plots. Yeah,
there's a lot. There's something in that system that a robot should be able to figure out at some point in the future, because it's not overly complicated. Just there's a lot of little detail work around all the headstones, and I think that might be something that if some robotic engineer can figure it out, that might be a slam dunk, because it's just so labor intensive to maintain cemeteries. In our world, not a lot of people think about that, but there's enormous acreage in that industry that requires maintenance, and it's a different type of maintenance than any other maintenance I've seen in turf management. So it's interesting you're doing work on that. I didn't know that. That's good.
So we're looking at that genetically, obviously, where we're looking at slower growing grasses than others to fit into those kind of situations.
That makes sense.
Still look good. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, about 2-3 months ago, I contacted you. I've been trying to get you on here for a while. Let's be honest here. Okay. But a couple of months ago, so I don't know if it was Valerio or one of my members asked, sent me an email. I can't remember how it got a hold of me. He said, "Hey, I'd like to listen to Dr. Munshaw talk about Bluemuda." And I'm like, well, that's a good idea, because I would too. As you know, when we were working together, you're doing a lot of work, and I was just trying to understand the advantages and management practices and fertility and pest programs when you're dealing with two cool season, permanent, but essentially perennial cool season and warm season grasses growing together. And so I'm basically going to plead ignorance this entire episode because I really don't understand it that well in terms of, I understand the basics, but the details of how we manage these systems and how they came about and all these things, I just don't know much about. And so that's why you're here. Thank you for coming on and doing that. You sent me the PowerPoint presentation. So I'll just forward the slides as necessary, and you just let me know, and we'll find our way through it. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. So, along those lines, Travis, there's a lot that I don't know still about this topic, even though, I don't know, I'd say at one point I was probably the one person on the planet that had done the most research with this. I don't know now who's doing what or what's happening necessarily. We've still got Bluemuda that we're testing here on site, but there's so many things, just different nuances to figure this thing out. And this is not a beginner type grass system. You have to know a little bit about growing grass, and managing two things together is certainly more challenging than managing one by itself. And so as we go through this today, you'll see maybe some of that we've learned by mistake, what not to do a lot of times. And, a lot of the science that I've done over the years and a lot of the lessons I've learned personally in my life have been through negative responses and
make a mistake, you learn from it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll talk a little bit about that stuff today, and I'll kind of explain how I got even into this. This is not some lightning bolt moment that I had that, what if I grow this with this?
Mm-hmm.
There was a whole process that led up to this. And so I'll kind of explain how I got involved and then go from there. So,
okay. You want to just start just for the people who may not know anything about Bluemuda at all, you want to start just what is it? Or is this on the next slide?
Yeah.
Is that the next slide? Do I need to go to the next slide? I don't even know.
Whatever. We can.
You tell me.
So Bluemuda is I guess it's a fitting name. It's a mixture of bluegrass and Bermuda grass, Kentucky bluegrass and Bermuda grass, excuse me. And it's maybe not the best name because this was a cultivar name from 20 some years ago that went away, but this is not a Bermuda grass cultivar. Obviously, this is a mixture of species.
No, there's a Bermuda grass cultivar called Bluemuda.
Not currently, but previously, yeah, one that's gone by the wayside. Yeah.
See, I didn't know that.
So yeah,
I don't know anything about.
So when this name,
go ahead.
Yeah, well, so when this name came up, I was like, well, that's maybe not the best name for it. Can you? But the guy that kind of championed this idea came up with this, and then it just blew up and took off, and this is what it is.
Okay.
And so yeah. So anyways, it's the two grasses together, and that's really all it is we've got a cool season grass and a warm season grass, one that's going to do well in the summer, one that's going to do well in the shoulder seasons. And ideally, you're going to have a year-round surface that is green and growing. That's kind of the idea with Bluemuda. So let's move into where most of this has happened. So a lot of my career, I've lived in this thing called the transition zone. So transition between climates. North of the transition zone, we've got cold winters, moderate summers. Cool season grasses are grown. South of the transition zone, hot summers, moderate winters. Warm season grasses are primarily grown. You see a little bit of cool season grasses here and there. And as cool season grasses improve, and as warm season grasses improve as well, you see grasses starting to blend up into the north with Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, and into the south with tall fescue and bluegrass. So if it's primarily cool season grasses in the north and warm season grasses in the south. What about the transition zone? So that has always been the challenge for turfgrass managers growing grasses across the country from Northern California to Maryland, Delaware, that area, is the grasses are going to struggle. Whether it's a warm season grass, the winters are cold in the transition zone, and so you see winter kill. If it's a cool season grass, the summers are tough, and you're going to get disease, and you're going to get stress issues. And so my predecessor at the University of Kentucky, who was my mentor, Dr. A.J. Powell, would say, in the transition zone, we can grow all grasses equally poorly. And, that's kind of sad, but it's true, right? There's just not a good choice for growing grass in the transition zone. And so that's part of why this whole Bluemuda thing came about, was because, well, there's just not one great choice mostly for athletic fields and golf courses, but certainly even into lawns, there's not, well, it's gotten better and better over time, and we'll talk about that. We can go on to the next one. So the tall fescues that are available today, if somebody asked me what is the one grass that you would recommend for lawns across the transition zone, I would say without hesitation, a good turf type tall fescue, one of the newer ones, something that has great heat tolerance, deep rooted for dealing with drought. It's got pest tolerance, doesn't have disease issues, not a whole lot of insect issues. They're super dense. They can keep weeds out, that sort of thing. And so for most situations for lawns, I would say a good turf type tall fescue. As you get into the southern transition zone, maybe people are growing some Bermuda grass, and in the northern transition zone, maybe some more bluegrass. But generally across the board, I would say a good turf type tall fescue. For sports, Bermuda grass is king across the transition zone. There's just not another surface out there that will take the abuse that Bermuda grass will, provide the good footing, and recover like Bermuda grass. But if you're playing football, where the season goes, obviously through the time where the grass is dormant, what about that? How does it recover once your grass has gone dormant? You do see some Kentucky bluegrass fields in the transition zone, not tons, but they're out there. There are some tall fescue fields usually on the lower end, but again, with these new turf type tall fescues that we can now mow down to half an inch and crazy things like that, they're becoming maybe a little bit more in fashion. And then you do see some perennial ryegrass fields as well. And perennial ryegrass, when it's good, man, it's good. But it is the grass that I absolutely love to hate. It is,
I was wondering where you're going with that. I was like, I'm not a huge fan of that either, but
no, it's for the transition zone, you're going to struggle with this grass. It's going to get diseased like crazy. And so, you'll see it, but it's probably not the best choice for the transition zone. If I was going to put that grass in, I would use it as an overseed in the south or as something up north where it's not going to get the problems on it. And then golf, creeping bent grass is pretty common on fairways. Zoysia grass is common on fairways. Bermuda grass is common on fairways. You occasionally will see some Kentucky blue, tall fescue, perennial ryegrass for the golf situation as well. And so the pictures at the bottom of the screen there, we've got Bermuda grass on the left side. That looks great. Mm-hmm. That's what you want your surface to look like. Dark green, dense, it's a pretty standard grass. The problem is, obviously, with Bermuda grass, you go to that middle picture where it's going to go dormant and it stops growing. The color recedes out of the leaves, and it's alive, but it's quiescent. It's sleeping through the wintertime. And so for 6 months of the year, that's what your surface looks like. Not ideal. And so for years, right, ryegrass was thrown onto that to make that prettier and to maybe give some recovery. The other bad thing about Bermuda grass is the picture on the far right there, where we get winter kill. Mm-hmm. And winter kill in the transition zone, depending where you are, can happen as often as every 4 years to every 6, 8, 10 years. And it also depends on the Bermuda grass variety that you're growing. There's certainly some that have better cold tolerance than others, but just because you put in a good Bermuda grass does not mean that you're going to keep it. And I'll give you, for instance, we have a trial here. We had a trial here with all the latest and greatest Bermuda grasses that did really well in the previous NTEP trial and survived the polar vortex and all that stuff. And here we are. I'm in zone 6A, which is, I'd say, kind of getting up to the northern part of the transition zone. And we lost every bit of our Bermuda grass this past winter.
Oh, really?
And we didn't have that not even that bad of a winter. We just didn't get snow cover or anything like that. And so it happens, right? You just get winter kill sometimes. Sometimes it's a factor of how.
Let's back up just a tiny bit here. When you say, how old were these Bermuda grasses that we're talking about? I'm assuming we don't need to name them necessarily, but all the newer grasses everybody's familiar with. Were they young?
The greatest, the ones that are selling the most. Yeah, no, they were 2 years old, so they weren't.
So they were
super
already
young.
They were already 2 years old.
Mature. Yeah.
And you're in Missouri, just so everybody understands, in 6A, right?
Yeah. We may actually just gotten changed with the new map to 6B, but 6B, anyways, that's right on that.
Yeah, it's sort of where Lexington is in terms of the hardiness zone map. But you're in the northern part of Missouri, and 2-year-old Bermuda grass cultivars, the newer ones, none of them survived. They all died.
Every one of them.
Wow, that's interesting. I don't know if I've seen that. Huh.
So the interesting thing about it was we had an old seeded one that has always been, it's an ugly grass, but it's always been touted for cold tolerance that did survive. And so,
really?
Wow. So anyways,
that's interesting.
That's not, my mission is not to bash Bermuda grasses today. It's it happens.
Yeah. I mean, because I have had some, I'm sure we all have had documented prolonged greenness in the fall and increased greenness in the spring from some of these newer cultivars. And we've had stories of, saw producers have the newer cultivars, they do survive. And when they have, the older cultivars didn't. And so the point is, at some point, if it gets bad enough, the grass is going to die. If it's in the transition, if it's Bermuda grass, it could potentially die regardless if you've spent the money on newer genetics. I still think there's value in those genetics. Do you? The newer genetics?
Yeah, well, I do. And I'll talk specifically about some of those as we go along today. But there's some things to really like. And it depends on your situation too. If you're growing a Bermuda grass just as a Bermuda grass and not worrying about anything else, then some of these new ones are fantastic and they're so dense and pretty and fine textured. But if you're wanting to put ryegrass or bluegrass or something into it, maybe there's better choices.
Okay. Yeah. Let's take a look.
Yeah. Okay.
So here's some more pictures, I guess. This is the next.
Yeah. So this is just bluegrass, right? There's a bluegrass lawn looking perfect there on the left. And that's what you're going to see in the spring and the fall. And we've had a cool spring here in Missouri, and it's been this perfect cool season grass growing weather. We're hitting 90s now, though. And so it's all going to go south on us. And so if we go dry, which we have not been at all, if we go dry, we're going to result in the middle there. You get drought dormancy on Kentucky bluegrass. So very similar to what you see with Bermuda grass, the grass, instead of trying to push down deep roots, it just shuts itself down. That's it. It just goes brown. And it's people, oftentimes I'd get calls as an extension specialist about, hey, my grass is dead. Why is my grass dead? Your grass isn't dead. Your grass is sleeping. As soon as the fall rains come, it'll wake up and get going.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. The only issue with having a dormant lawn is that there is no competition for crabgrass and things like that can come along.
Sure.
But if it's that dry, maybe you don't have the weed pressure. If it's irrigated or if you have a wet summer, you've got issues like on the far right there, where diseases are very prevalent with Kentucky bluegrass varieties. They've gotten better and better and better over time, but still that one specifically is summer patch. That one is kind of the big one with Kentucky bluegrass. And if the conditions are right, 70-degree nights, 90-degree days, and for our European friend, that's low 20s to mid 30s. You're going to see this stuff showing up. It's just the grass gets stressed out. If the disease if the pathogen is present, the chance of getting disease is high.
Yeah.
And so again, this is why there's just not a great one grass system for the transition zone.
Okay.
All right. So you probably have seen something like this over the years where cool season grasses grow great in the spring. They really slow down in the summer. You get less shoot growth, you get less root growth, but then they recover to some degree in the fall, and then they kind of slow down over the winter, and then the cycle repeats. Warm season grasses are the exact opposites, where they're not doing anything in the wintertime. They slowly come out in the spring and get cranking for midsummer as it's hot and humid. They're loving life. And then they start to slow down as it goes into the fall and then back into dormancy. And so this is what we're looking at with cool season grasses in the transition zone. We've got tough summers. And with our warm season grasses, we've got great summers, but we've got tough winters. And so go to the next one. This is what ideally, and this is the good art kind of work that I do when I'm just sitting around doodling at home. This is what we'd like to see, right? We don't want that summer slump. We don't want that winter slump. We would like something to be doing something most times of the year. Maybe we don't care about December, January, where there's really not a whole lot of sports going on or anything like that. But most of the time, we want something that is green and growing. And that is kind of where Bluemuda fits in.
Okay.
All right. So, like I said, I am not some kind of genius that just sits around and comes up with new ideas all the time. And this is not new at all. Even when I started researching this back 10 years ago or so, I had no clue that this had been looked at previously. And so folks down at UC Riverside back in the 50s played with this. They had old Bermuda grasses and they had old bluegrasses, but they found when they mixed them together for that California climate, they were able to have good, pretty grasses year round, and they were resistant to weeds, right? Sounds pretty good. All right. Then you find nothing else in the literature until 1977, where folks at the University of Maryland said, if you mix Bermuda grass and bluegrass together, you're going to have the best of all worlds. They overcome their individual weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
All right. But then it goes away again. All right. So the only thing that I can come up with for, these are good ideas, but why did they go away? Was because the bluegrasses or the other cool season grasses that they had at that time were not suited for either doing well year round, that had the heat tolerance or whatever, or the mowing height challenges that we may have in some situations. Even in the 70s, that would be the case. Breeding has just blown up over the last 10, 15 years, where the varieties have gotten better and better, and this has changed everything. And so that's why I think today Bluemuda works, whereas in the 50s and 70s, they had these ideas, but they just came and went because I don't think the grasses that they had were capable of surviving.
So the idea was there. It's just the genetics hadn't caught up with it yet.
I think that's what it was. Yep.
Okay.
And I don't have proof of that, but that's just what I'm assuming based on the grasses that they had available at that time.
Okay. All right.
And so they had grasses like Kentucky 31 tall fescue, right? That is ugly and grows like crazy and is not dense. It's just, that's just what they had available to them. All right. So this is kind of where things started to turn around. So one thing it's kind of surprising about Bermuda grass, but it's actually fairly common. Bermuda grass as a sod, you would think with all the rhizomes and stolons that are knitting across that grass would hold together really well as a sod. But a lot of times it doesn't. If you cut Bermuda grass sod and hold it up, like hold it up in front of you, it'll just kind of fall apart. And so there was a sod producer in northern Italy that was growing Bermuda grass and could not keep his sod together, his Bermuda grass sod together. And so he had the idea of, what if I throw some bluegrass in there? Because Kentucky bluegrass is a rhizomatous species, to help knit this Bermuda grass together, and then I'll get the Bermuda grass out to people, and then they can kill the bluegrass or whatever they want to do. All right, so good idea. And this whole Bermuda grass falling apart thing still occurs with the new latest and greatest. One of our local athletic fields here, they are sodding fields right now and brought in one of the new great cultivars that they couldn't lay because the sod just all fell apart. And so, happens all the time. And so this bluegrass idea was a pretty decent idea. There was a fellow that was visiting Italy that worked for a seed company that saw this and thought, maybe there's something to this. And he wrote a little paper about it, just, his thoughts and observations. And that's what's kind of gotten the ball rolling for this current Bermuda grass or Bluemuda, flurry of activity was this guy seeing this field and then writing this article up.
I didn't know that.
So
yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, just something that they put on their webpage, and just nothing scientific or anything. Just hey, this looked cool. Maybe there's something to this.
Yeah.
So that then led to this fella right here. This is Brian Winka. He is a sports field manager in the St. Louis area, and he had been at this facility for a number of years, but acres and acres and acres of grass, a lot of Bermuda grass. And he had been overseeding with ryegrass for years and years. And he was trying to come up with something different. And he saw this article from this guy that had seen the grass in Italy and thought, hey, maybe this is something I should try. Talk to him. And, they started scratching their heads about, well, would this work for St. Louis? Would this work for athletics? Maybe. And so this guy decided, he had lots of equipment. He had a big budget. He was able to try things out and jumped into it. So move on to the next one. All right. So here's the issue with ryegrass. Ryegrass, like I said, I love to hate it. It's so pretty. When it's pretty, it is pretty. And that's what you see is just dark green, stripes up well, but then go to the next. But then if you leave it in, this is one of my plots that I had at the University of Kentucky, where I left the ryegrass in all summer. You can see the dark spots there are ryegrass that are holding on. This picture would have been taken in August. And the light green there is Bermuda grass that is trying to come back. But this is August. And if that ryegrass has held this grass back this long, it's going to be struggling going into the winter. It's not going to be ready. Obviously, this is not going to be filled. And if you've got to play sports on this in the winter, in the fall, then you're going to have a patchy stand where you're going to have to obviously get more ryegrass out there to make it look halfway decent. And so that's one of the reasons why ryegrass is not a good thing, because it produces a chemical called allelopathy, and it holds other plants back that are around it. And so what do? Every year we spray it out. We get a chemical in the spring, kill off the ryegrass, let the Bermuda grass come back, and then we overseed it again. And so you're spending a lot of money in seed. You're spending a lot of money in chemical to kill off the ryegrass in the spring. And agronomically, it makes absolutely no sense to be spending that money and using those kind of chemicals. And so, if you're me, you all don't know me, but I'm not a tree hugger, but I certainly don't want to just sling chemicals if I don't have to. If there's a cultural method of doing something, that's the way that I want to do it. And so I'm all for not spraying something out if we can avoid it. All right. So about that same time that Brian was talking to this seed company guy, this grass that actually the guy that he was talking to worked for that company, they came up with a bluegrass blend called HGT. And it was just this new generation of bluegrasses that kind of blew everybody away. So this was at a golf course in Missouri, where this golf course superintendent was trying to figure out, what do we do? Our fairways aren't great. Let's try some things. And this is midsummer. And the creep and bentgrass, obviously somebody's driven through that with maybe something on the tire, or maybe that's just heat stress from driving across it. but it shouldn't look that bad. The ryegrass doesn't look great, but that bluegrass looks pretty stinking good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so he thought, well, maybe this is something that we should try because this is being mowed at half an inch here. The grass looks good. It's surviving. There's no disease on it. Let's just see if I throw this in. And there's some things that are going to pop up on the screen here, Travis. You can just kind of flip through them. All those good things about it, fast germ, all that stuff. Maybe this is something that could work for this whole Bluemuda thing.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead. So this, at the same time, this was me in Kentucky. This field was in Bowling Green, big soccer complex that lost 90% of their grass to winter kill that winter. And this was my NTEP Bermuda trial where I lost, I don't know, maybe 2/3 of it to winter kill. Actually, that year, because there was so much winter kill, I don't know if that was a polar vortex year or what it was, but Dr. Bigelow drove down from Purdue because he had so much winter kill on his NTEP Bermuda grass trial that he had to come and get plugs for me to reestablish his trial.
Well, the photo on the left is a soccer complex in Bowling Green. The one on the right is from Lexington, your research here in Lexington. Is that?
In Lexington, yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So just widespread Bermuda grass winter kill. And so, if this is your situation, if you are expecting your Bermuda grass to wake up and it just doesn't, then what? What do you do? If you've got any play on those fields in the spring or in the summer, you're in trouble. If you don't, then you've got a couple of months to reestablish. But, this is the situation that a lot of people were in. And this has been going on for a lot of years. All right. So I spoke at the SFMA conference that year, and I was talking about grass options for the transition zone. And after I was done speaking, this fellow, Brian, walked up to me and he said, "What do you think about growing cool season and warm season grasses in the transition?" I said, "Well, isn't that what we just kind of talked about?" And he said, "No, together."
Oh.
And I was like, "No, that's stupid. You're an idiot." And
okay.
And I joke. Obviously, he's not an idiot, but he's heard me say that many, many times at this point. But he said, "No." He goes, "I've been doing it in St. Louis for the last year and a half. Come out to St. Louis and look at my complex and let me know what you think." So I did. I drove out there and looked at his fields, and I was like, "Man, this is interesting." And so kept talking with him, got to know him, became really good friends with the guy over the years. And from that, we started our first research project with Bluemuda. Again, I don't know anything about this. He knows very little bit about this, just what he's kind of learned playing around with it. And so we tried seeding rates. We tried, we put pretty ryegrass up against Kentucky bluegrass to see if there was any differences leaving these things in long term. We tried vertical mowing before seeding, so drilling basically, versus just drop seeding. And then we looked at different fertilizers as well. And again, we were just trying things, just seeing, throw it at the wall, see what sticks, see if there's anything interesting whatsoever.
So you're just trying, the initial phase is just trying to figure out how to manage these things. What
is this, right? Yeah. I know nothing about this. All right. So that first picture was a couple months after seeding. This one is 7 months after fertilizing, 8 months after seeding. And I think one of the interesting things, I'm not a polycoat fertilizer kind of guy. I don't like the plastic that goes out. And maybe, Travis, you can help me with a better slow release nitrogen source than a polycoat that's going to give me the same kind of longevity out of a product. But we had really good sustained color from that polycoat application. 2 pounds put down at planting, and it kept it green through summer, again, 7 months later.
Do you remember if you put the same amount of nitrogen as urea? That's what that urea treatment is?
Yeah.
2 pounds?
Yeah, all were the same. Yeah.
And this is 7 months. Yeah, so it's after 7 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
So
next,
go back to that last one.
I'm sorry.
So this obviously is from above, but if you were to, this was about the time of our field day, and all the people that were coming up to look at these from eye level, these look washed out and stuff in this picture, but it was dark green. There was, it the stripes up like crazy. It looked really good. And I thought, hey, maybe there's something here. And you can see the control plot on the far left where there's absolutely nothing.
Mm.
And then the VM of the vertical mode plots, there was more grass there than there was in the plots that just got drop seeded. But I thought this is kind of cool. But I had done nothing other than put down that fertilizer in the fall. We mowed these things at 3/4 of an inch, but that's it. That's all the maintenance that they got to them at all. All right, so now go to the next one. And then on top of that, we decided to put a traffic simulator across them to see, well, are they any better than just Bermuda grass by itself? And this is Riviera Bermuda grass, which was a common type Bermuda that very popular. Now it's not sold at all, but was a good cold tolerant Bermuda grass, but an open canopy, not super dense. And this was December, and you can see there's some grass there, but it's not great. It's not like I wouldn't call my mom and say, hey, wow, you got to see this, drive down and look at these plots. I've come up with something that's amazing. It was just so.
Mm-hmm.
But again, these had not been fertilized. They did not get a single drop of water other than what came down in the rain. And, there was some grass there, but again, nothing too spectacular. And so, we didn't neglect them because we mowed them, but we didn't probably maintain them to the level that they should have been. Go to the next one. Again, nothing done whatsoever to these grasses. And this was the drop seed plot here next to the control. And you can see a bunch of annual bluegrass popping up in these plots. But you've got a lot of bluegrass coming back there in the spring. It's not perfect. It's clumpy a little bit, but it's starting to look like there's a grass that's holding on here.
Yeah, I just want to make sure it's clear. I just want to make sure the audience doesn't misunderstand anything. This is a question to you, Gregg. During these initial years, is it the case that you're really, like as you mentioned, you're really just throwing stuff out to see what happens, see how to manage it, and see what influences it both beneficially and harmfully? In other words, this isn't representative of what someone would expect with this system. You have a bunch of paint and you're trying to you're just throwing stuff up and see what the colors look like right now. And then later you start to refine it and really start to develop BMPs for these sorts of system. Is that the case?
That is the case. And that's, an end user, a field manager doesn't have this luxury to have their fields look bad. They've got to be, the guys that were doing, like Brian, that were doing Bluemuda early on here, they were fertilizing, they were irrigating to keep these grasses looking nice. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know. Like I was like, well, how low maintenance is this? Can I just reduce my inputs to next to nothing to have this work? I just wanted to see. And so, sure. I'd say with not doing anything other than dropping some seed there, it did okay.
Okay.
Not perfect, but it did okay. And so I still thought, this is kind of interesting. So go on to the next one. Same area. You can see in this picture some of that perennial ryegrass holding on, but this is midsummer the next year. And so this is now a year and a half old. And you can see, again, nothing's been done to these, no fertilizer, no nothing. This is where we were at for the dark green. Obviously, there is the bluegrass hanging on. And then you can see the control plot there in the back where it says Bermuda only, how much lighter green that is. Mm-hmm. And so here's kind of what we kind of figured out early on is that you are going to get better color. All right. Obviously, the especially these older Bermuda grass varieties are kind of this limey green color. If we throw something into that mix that gives them some darker color, it's just going to make the area look prettier. We're going to get it to stripe because Bermuda grass generally doesn't stripe. Bluegrass does stripe. And so we did find that we were able to stripe these things up. But what we did see that was really interesting was that in the fall, the bluegrass would kind of come on, start filling up those plots, and then in the spring, just blow up. and we've got all sorts of bluegrass growing in this Bermuda grass.
What do you mean? What do you mean blow up in the spring? What do you mean?
So the plants would start to tiller, and because it's the perfect growing conditions for cool season grasses once you get into March and April in the transition zone, and they would thicken up.
Okay.
And you'd see these plants just it would fill up with this dark green Kentucky bluegrass.
Okay.
But then as you got into summer and that summer slump comes on, that bluegrass would get less and less and less, and you get more and more Bermuda grass. And so it was just a constant ebb and flow where they would fight each other, and the strongest grass would win. And so you saw that picture that I showed you with the ryegrass, where the ryegrass and Bermuda grass fought, and they both kind of lost. These two tended, well, at least what we saw was that they played nice together. The Bermuda grass wouldn't thin out. It would just continue to thicken up while the bluegrass took a back seat. And then it was the opposite as we got into the fall and into the spring. Okay. And so, but what we did see from this early trial was that if you're needing pretty green grass, as soon as that Bermuda grass goes dormant without putting any more seed down or anything like that, maybe you're not going to get it. You know, bluegrass isn't like ryegrass where it's going to germinate in 4 days or 6 days and be perfect after a couple of weeks. It's slower, and it may take 10 days to germinate and then a month to really come on. And so that was one thing that we saw was for athletics, if that's what you're wanting is a surface that's going to be perfect for showing on TV, you know, maybe this wasn't it.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So at this time, you know, showing these things at field days, talking about them on social media, you know, starting to talk about this stuff in presentations at national meetings, and it's starting to get attention. And so other seed companies are coming to me at this time and saying, well, what about other bluegrasses? Is this one that you're trying, this HGT, is it the only one that works? And I said, well, it's the only one I've used. I don't know. And so I had companies coming to me, giving me a whole bunch of bluegrasses and saying, test our grasses, see if they will work. And so this was kind of phase 2, where threw a whole bunch of different bluegrasses down, beat the stew out of them, and found that no, they're not all great. Some of them work, some of them don't work. But we did find, interestingly, from this study that if you traffic the plots, the Bermuda grass plots, down to basically no cover, you'll still have about 40% cover in your Bluemuda plots. And so we thought, you know what, there's one important finding right there, is that we're getting a lot more traffic tolerance because of that bluegrass in those Bermuda grass plots.
And that's what this photo is saying. So basically the Bermuda only, you're seeing it where much thinner. Now the Bluemuda on this side here is obviously thinning, but it's nowhere near to the same degree that just Bermuda only is. But you also have Bluemuda here, and this is a different cultivar Bluemuda, or is this the same cultivar on the left and the right here?
So yeah, we were trafficking only half of the plot.
Okay.
And so that I think that's where your box is there. It would be the other half of that plot.
Okay. All
right. So from that study, the company that I was working with actually came up with the Seed Mix 365 SS, which is one of the ones that's used an awful lot for Bluemuda now, along with HGT. But so at this time, you know, all the seed companies are excited, right? Because here's a chance to get bluegrass growing in the transition zone where previously it wasn't used a whole lot. And so I put a call out to all the seed companies and I said, hey, you know, I want to do this trial. Send me what you got and we'll test it and see what happens. So I got 59 different grasses. Most of them were Kentucky bluegrasses. I had some companies send me some tall fescues that they thought might work at 3/4 of an inch. And then I had a company that sent me some bulbous bluegrasses, which I didn't know anything about at all at that time, to see if they might work. And bulbous bluegrasses kind of just on their own shut down every summer and then come back every fall. And so in theory, they made some sense, but they didn't work in this situation.
Well hold on. So in theory, let me just, if I can just ask a question. So I didn't know you had tall fescues in here. I'm assuming they're a lower cut variety and so forth. But my understanding of this system, or one of the advantages, particularly say on sport turf, was that because bluegrass can spread, whereas perennial ryegrass won't, that it'll continue to spread and recover from damage and wear and so forth. But tall fescues won't do that either. And tall fescue was in this study. How did that connect in your mind? I mean, what were you thinking on, like, what would you expect to see?
Well, again, this was just, I said, hey, throw me what you've got that you think might work.
Okay.
And so some of these seed companies said, hey, we've got some tall fescues that they thought might work. So, but I agree. Most ryegrasses we think of as bunch type grasses, no stolons, no rhizomes.
Okay.
You hear about some new spreading type ryegrasses, but I've tested these things. I can tell you that they are not going to produce stolons or rhizomes, but what you might see is some more aggressive tillering. So they're going to spread quicker than an old ryegrass, but not like bluegrass or Bermuda grass.
It's not going to. Yeah, it's not going to send out runners and fill in bare spots like bluegrasses or what. So I mean, so is my thought process, or is it correct in the sense that not only are you blending a warm season and a cool season together, they both are spreading type grasses that you're blending together, and they don't provide any allelopathic effect on the other.
Right. Yeah, they're both. Yeah, bluegrass and Bermuda grass both spreading.
Yeah.
Ideally, both are going to help to, if for athletics type situation, hold that surface together better and get better footing, and obviously better recovery is what we were really thinking about.
Okay.
So some of these new tall fescues, though, well, so if you look at Kentucky 31.
Yeah. Oh, please, I don't want to.
There's an awful lot of it.
I look at it every time I go into Lowe's. It's the ton right in front of the checkout center at Lowe's. And I'm like, can you move this to the back? I'm sorry, I should keep my mouth shut. Go ahead.
Well, and it says on the bag, it says huge words, lawn seed, and then in really small words, and field. I'm just like, no, stop.
I know.
But anyways, if you pull a clump of Kentucky 31 up, you'll find big old rhizomes on that grass. So tall fescue, we think about as a bunch type grass, but it's actually a rhizomatous species.
Sure.
And so what we'll see with tall fescues is, depending on mowing height, a lot of times, the taller that we mow, the more rhizomes we'll have. The shorter that you mow, the less you'll have. But they do have the ability to spread a little bit. But again, most of the spread that we're getting from tall fescues is from tillering.
Okay.
So anyways, but most of the tall fescues up to this point, I would say, forget about tall fescues, because that's a lawn grass. It can't be mowed at 3/4. Forget about it. I see somebody in the chat saying something about Texas bluegrass. Great question. So Texas hybrids still exist and are used, and I had some in that trial. Texas bluegrass alone is a pretty ugly grass, but when hybridized with Kentucky bluegrass, is a heat tolerant grass that is actually okay. And so there are several on the market, and I can't say a whole lot bad about them. Some of them have come and gone over the years, but there are some good ones that are still out there.
Interesting.
So, yeah. Okay. So this was, I think, 2018, fall of 2018, I planted this, and go to the next one. We beat the stew out of these. We put traffic on them. We put a shear tester on these things to see, are they way better than Bermuda grass alone? And one of the things we were really trying to figure out was, because we had so many different bluegrasses in here from so many different bluegrass families, is there a certain family? Is there a certain bluegrass? Which ones are going to make it? Which ones aren't going to make it? And so, you look at some of these plots that have got traffic on them, and you can see some of them are beat down way worse than others. You look at the other side of the plot where the grass looks great, thick, whereas some don't. And I've circled some here that are fairly popular, that have been used quite a bit in Bluemuda. And you can see kind of how they stood up to traffic. Those three, I'd say, did pretpretty well compared to some of the plots up there.
So we're talking about
and how badly they got.
365 SS and HGT and HD Sport 2.0. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So those three are commonly used for Bluemuda, more so than I'd say anything else.
Okay.
And probably mostly HGT and 365. But again, we really just beat these things up. We were trying to see, what's going on. On to the next one. All right. So because I had so many bluegrasses out there, this was the obvious question. Every time I'd give a presentation on this, I would get the question, okay, so which one do I use? Which bluegrass should I grow? And of course, I was a university scientist. I was not going to say use this one or use that one, right? Because that wasn't my job. My job wasn't to sell seed for a company. My job was to see how things did. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned bluegrass families a minute ago. Here's a bunch of the bluegrass families on there, and within each one of those families, you may have a dozen or more different bluegrasses. And so one of the studies I had out at UK when I left was looking at bluegrass families to see if the family type had an effect on how well the grass did. Because as I got into this study, I found that some grasses, like midnight types are dark green. They're very heat tolerant, but they wanted to hang on in the summertime, and they didn't play very well with the Bermuda grass. And so move on to the next picture.
Well, before we do, just real quick, Greg, and I want you to keep your thought, but I just want to make sure everybody understands the photograph here. All of those are bluegrass, and you can see a wide variety in the dense, or the color, even the density, but the color particularly fades from a lighter green to a very dark green, and all of them are bluegrass. And so I guess what the point is, I want to make sure everybody understands is that we probably do, but just because you have Kentucky bluegrass doesn't mean that it's going to solve whatever problem that you read in some magazine. There are great differences in genetics as seen on this photograph. Pretty clear. I remember walking across those plots many, many, many times. And I'm like, man, some of these are extremely resilient when it comes to drought. Other ones just shut down. It's amazing. And they're all the same species, just different cultivars. Sorry, I didn't mean
to. Well, and you think about, no, it's a great point. And you think about, humans, right? We're all the same species, but we've got all sorts of different shades of colors. But even within a race, we've got all sorts of genetic differences. And so we'll see that even in these different family types, we'll see differences between the different varieties. There's just huge differences in these things. And it's super interesting. It's, people that do a lot of breeding and have been in the seed industry for a lot of years know way more about all these families than I do, but some of them are very aggressive. Some of them have heat tolerance. Some of them have light color, dark color, whatever, all these differences within these different families of bluegrasses, but they're all bluegrasses.
Yeah. Okay. Next one.
Okay. So that picture there, this would have been midsummer, where you can see Bermuda grass coming in pretty well. And you see a dark colored bluegrass in the plot, but it's not consistent. And so, this may have been one of the plots that fought a little bit with the Bermuda grass and wanted to hold on into the summer. Doesn't look horrible by any means, but it was, I would rather see a whole bunch of Bermuda grass in the summer rather than, patches of dark green where we know that something else is grown.
Yeah, and to the members in the chat, please go ahead and post your questions, and I'll answer them at the end. But I want to ask, or I'll have Dr. Munshaw attempt to answer them at the end. But I want to ask one of the Valerio's questions now, because it has to do with what you just said, Greg. And his question is, the problem with Bluemuda is perhaps the lack of homogeneity, which is what this photograph shows. Especially in winter, how to avoid this problem, how to avoid having a dormant yellow Bermuda grass among patches of Poa or vice versa. So when you see this photograph, there is a lack of homogeneity. It is sort of splotchy here and there. You want to try to address that question now? I mean, what can we do to avoid the lack of homogeneity?
So variety matters. That's what I found from this trial, was that not every Kentucky bluegrass is suitable for using in Bluemuda.
Okay.
And so this bluegrass that we're seeing right here looks patchy, not homogeneous or not homogeneous, not pretty
Yeah.
in the middle of summer, but this may come back in fall and look okay in the winter.
Okay.
It may not.
Hmm.
But go to the next one. So here's two different plots, right? This is spring. They're starting to look pretty good at this point. In Kentucky, the bluegrasses would wake up about March 15th and start coming on like crazy. And so this is about 2 or 3 weeks after the bluegrasses would have started waking up. And so that plot on the left there obviously looks pretty dense, pretty well covered in Kentucky bluegrass.
Mm-hmm.
The one on the right there would have been one that fought with the Bermuda grass and struggled. And then the light green you see there is annual bluegrass.
Yeah.
That is now come into those voids where the bluegrass did not come back.
Okay, so your take on this is that because of I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but because of the genetics of this particular species on the right, not being as dense or not playing well with the Bermuda or whatever the case is in terms of its growth, interaction with the system, it leaves the canopy open. It doesn't grow in as densely, and then allows these Poa annua to come in and take over. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, that's what we saw.
And the solution is genetics, getting the right bluegrass for that location and that system?
Right, because, in the couple of years that this trial was in, we saw this stuff over and over again, this kind of thing, where the plots that were good the first year were good the second year. The plots that were not good the first year had this same issue where they would, eventually this bluegrass is going to continue to tiller and spread as the temperatures are great for it through April and May and maybe even early June. But then it still wants to keep growing. Okay. And that Bermuda grass wants to keep growing too. And so that's where we run into problems. We don't want it to be that ryegrass situation where they're fighting each other, right? We want the grasses to work well together.
Okay, perfect.
Right? So to answer that question, which Kentucky bluegrass to use, I always go back to the NTEP trials, and I'll look at things like, turf quality. I want a pretty grass for one thing, but there are midnight types that have great heat tolerance that are pretty. All right, so that doesn't really help me. And so from here, I'll look at maybe some of the summer quality to see, did it go down slightly? And maybe one of the ones that went down a little bit in quality in the summertime might be interesting for a Bluemuda cultivar because it's not going to be as aggressive. But on the flip side of that, I want to look at things like establishment and things like that, because I want to see, or if somebody did a traffic test, I want to see one that has good traffic tolerance, and I want to see aggression, because we need a grass that can fill in voids and spread through this Bermuda grass and compete with the Bermuda grass when the Bermuda grass is not growing as quickly as possible. So to say it in a different way, when the Bermuda grass starts to slow down in September and October, I need that bluegrass to jump and to fill in. Ideally, I don't want to put down a whole bunch more seed. I'd rather just seed one time. And then maybe if I had to seed soccer gold mouths or something like that, high wear areas, that'd be okay. But if I could avoid seeding every year, that would be ideal. And so we've been able to do that, but it involves managing water. If you've got dry summers, the bluegrass stays in that dormant state, doesn't really want to come on. And so encouraging it with some water in September gets it to come out and start to fill in a little bit better. But again, this is not ryegrass where it's just immediately going to be a really pretty stand for October 15th. It may be great, but it may be, depending on the fall and temperatures, it may be slow coming out, and it may not be perfect until March.
Okay.
which is tough for some people to stand.
Yeah. Okay. For those who may not be familiar, these are what we're looking on the screen is the NTEP rating data. And the way these are ranked, you can look over here on the far right-hand side, and it has the mean, and they're ranked in descending order. But these are across, 7 or 8, 9 locations for this in this particular data set. That's bluegrass. We have Illinois and Kansas, Michigan, Minnesota, and all these different locations. And then the average is taken across. Greg, the average is kind of, you got to rank them somehow. But if you're in middle of Tennessee, you might have genetics might respond differently in Tennessee than they would in Wisconsin or Michigan. So you might want to look at your location specific rating date. Like, for example, I'm from Oklahoma. If I wanted it Oklahoma specific, then I just want to look at this particular column because it might not line up with the overall mean across locations, just so people who might not be looking at NTEP data.
Yeah, for sure. Looking at your region, that you can break down this into your region. And so for Valerio, you're going to want to look at a climate that's the most similar to yours, whether you're in northern Italy or central Italy, wherever you are.
I think he's in northern Italy.
Okay, so California, you're going to be in transition zone in northern Italy. And so, several of these locations are going to work. But there is if you go to NTEP, you can click on transition zone.
Yeah.
And so you can get means across the different transition zone locations to kind of see how they all did.
Yeah.
And then statistics, they play a part in this as well. That blue box that I've got there is the top statistical group from the NTEP trial. And so, these are the top performers in all of these different locations, across all these different locations. Does that mean my screen's blurry, so I don't know what's what here, but no, it's fine. But whatever's right below the blue box there doesn't necessarily mean that it's any worse, really, than some of the ones above it. But again, that's when I'm looking at these things, I'll probably try and look at the best ones, the best statistical group, and then go from there.
Yeah. So in Bluemuda systems, if I understand you correctly, you're looking for a combination of both Bermuda grass and Bluemuda or bluegrass that grows when that cultivar is supposed to be growing. Like, let's say bluegrass is supposed to be really growing in the spring and the fall, but then also shuts down and lets Bermuda grass do its job in the summer. And if that's true, I'm not saying it is, I'm asking if that's true, that might not be representative from data in an NTEP trial necessarily. It may, but may not. Is that the case, Greg?
That is the case. So, one of the tough things is there's people growing bluegrass in places like Atlanta, where I would traditionally say, man, that's a bad decision. And, what I've learned over the years is you can grow really any grass anywhere you want to, if you want to put enough inputs into it. And for that person that's doing that, maybe that makes total sense. And, for other people, maybe it doesn't. But with these bluegrasses that maybe do slow down a little bit in the summer, that, not midnight types, you can still keep them looking good by watering them, by getting fungicides out, things like that, and, keeping them happy and growing so they don't shut down, so they're not getting completely stressed out. Well, but it's a lot of management.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. You can grow grass anywhere. We had a bent grass putting green in Fort Lauderdale for like 3 or 4 years. It was there. We're mowing it. But man, it was every day. It was doing everything we could to keep that thing alive. But you can do it if you want to put the resources into it.
Right. Yeah. So you see fans and stuff on golf courses to try and keep those grasses happy, and it's doable, but does it make sense?
Oh my gosh. So it makes no sense.
Right.
But can do it.
But that's one of the things I like about Bluemuda is that we've got this pretty grass, right? Bluegrass is a pretty grass. And even when it's not growing a whole lot in the summertime, it's still slightly improving the color of the Bermuda grass.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be a darker green color.
It's still enhancing the striping and all of that stuff. So even if it's not quite as vigorous as it was in the spring, and it's not as prevalent as it was in the spring, there's still grass there, and it's still part of that overall system.
Yeah.
Most of it's Bermuda, but there's a lot there.
Good.
So So then what about management, right? I mean, so,
Oh, wait, wait.
one of the other questions was, well, are you going to get all sorts of disease on your grass?
Well, that's what I was going to ask at
Well,
some point, like the pest management, those
yeah.
sorts of
So
things.
let's save that and we'll get into that. Let's talk Bermudas real quick here.
Okay.
So two different Bermuda grasses, vastly different here, right? On the left, new hybrid, really dense, just so crazy thick. And on the right, we've got a common Bermuda grass
Mm-hmm.
that not very dense, big leaves, that sort of thing. So what about that? And again, this is a study that I had out at UK when I left.
Mm-hmm.
And but what we've seen is the more open canopies, like the one on the right there,
Mm.
it's going to be a lot easier to get bluegrass up and growing in that than in the grass on the left.
Okay.
You can thin out the grass on the left with a vertical mower and get seed into it. But next summer, what about that? What about when that grass becomes super dense again? What happens to the bluegrass? And so we found that some of these really thick new Bermuda grasses are going to be tougher to have this. It's doable again, but does it
Okay.
make 100% sense? I don't know if it
That's
does.
interesting. Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, so one of the places that I help out with, they have one of these new Bermuda grasses, and they've got actually fescue and bluegrass growing in it. But that Bermuda grass has not liked it at all. Hasn't uh, actually is been kept down because of the taller fescue and bluegrass growing in it, and hasn't been a part of the stand whatsoever. So it's really turned into a bluegrass and fescue
Okay.
facility.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's
Interesting.
it's interesting how things change with mowing heights and stuff. But
Sure.
had it been mowed at half inch, then probably would have been 100% Bermuda grass.
Maybe. Yeah. So here's some Bermuda grass ratings.
Yeah. So ratings from NTEP again, and I think it says spring density. So
Spring
um,
density. Yeah.
again, density is one of the first things that I'd look at. So the ones at the top there, like Tiff Tough, Latitude 36, Iron Cutter, Tiffway, Tahoma, those kind of grasses are super dense.
Hmm.
It's not impossible to do this in because that study where I had the 59 different bluegrasses in was Tiffway, and it's one of the best ones up there at the top.
Okay.
And so it's doable to do this.
Yeah. But
It's just easier if you've got a more open canopy.
so you're not necessarily shying away from ones towards the top, but you'd probably be more
No,
inclined to look at something more a little lower than the most dense Bermuda grass to allow the bluegrass to proliferate and have room to grow. I guess is that the way I'm looking at it? Right.
well, I would hope that nobody would kill off their Bermuda grass to put in something less dense because they wanted to try this. I
Oh yeah, I
would,
wasn't.
whatever Bermuda grass you have, regardless if it's super dense
Yeah.
or not very dense, that's your Bermuda grass. And
Okay.
so then let's see if this works.
Okay.
And so with anything, I don't know that I would go all in on any idea, anything that's new. I would
Mm-hmm.
try an area, see how you do with it through the first year. And if you have super great success with it and it makes sense to you, then you go all in after year one or year two,
Yeah.
whatever, after you
Yeah.
tried it. Yeah.
Okay. It's just interesting that the idea is that really, really dense Bermuda grasses might not necessarily be the ideal Bermuda grass for this type of system. May, but may not be. That's interesting. I didn't really think about that prior to today. So good. Okay.
So I put a study out in 2019 with Dr. Goatley at Virginia Tech,
Hmm.
and we both put it into latitude 36 Bermuda, which is really dense, and we just drop seeded it. We didn't vertical mow.
Hmm.
And both of us had the same issue, right? Because that grass is so thick,
Hmm.
that bluegrass seed, even after being brushed into the canopy, it just struggled.
Really?
And we got a little bit of bluegrass, but not very much. And so if you do have one of those dense ones, you've got to thin it out.
Okay. And that's the
That's
idea
the
behind
critical thing.
verticutting and opening up the canopy prior to seeding.
Yeah.
Okay. Makes sense.
Getting some seed soil contact and just giving the grass some room to grow.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Again, the other thing I'd look at is if you're putting a new Bermuda grass in, look for your location, what makes sense for surviving. right? If you can't survive, if your grass is not going to survive, it makes no sense to put it in. So I'll beat up on Tifway a little bit because it's nobody's marketing that grass.
Yeah, you won't upset anybody.
No, I won't. Well, so maybe some sod producers, but
well, maybe.
Not my goal. Anyway, Tifway's a great grass, and I've seen acres and acres and acres of it in my life. But in the transition zone, especially as you get into the northern transition zone, it doesn't have the cold tolerance, and so you're going to get winter kill on that grass a lot more frequently than you are grasses that you see at the bottom of this table, excuse me.
Oh, so in this trial, in these data, you're looking at the ones who survived are at the bottom down here.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the ones at the top died basically, or had the most death.
A lot of them did. Yeah. I mean, you can see their 99% death in Indiana for that first one, and whatever it was in Kentucky.
Interesting.
So yeah, pay attention to that. And even if you're not doing Bluemuda, if you're speccing a new Bermuda grass in for the transition zone, pay attention to the cold tolerance factor. That is really important. And, maybe you don't want to jump on one of these new ones because, like I said, I had all of these new ones planted here, and I lost every one of them this past winter.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes going with some older ones, if they're available, can make some sense.
Okay.
All right, let's move on to the next one. Okay. So most of the stuff that we were doing was short mode for golf fairways, athletic fields, that sort of thing. But I did do one trial with a seeded commony type Bermuda grass where I let them grow up to 5 inches. So I had mowing heights of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 inches. And I had really good, so my thought was to back up a little bit. My thought was the bluegrass is going to come up in the spring. It's going to shade out the Bermuda grass, and we're going to result in a bluegrass stand with that tall height. But I didn't see that. I saw a good mix of both grasses growing together.
Okay.
But again, this is a common type Bermuda grass that wants to grow up tall. That's naturally what it's trying to do. These new ones aren't trying to do that. They're trying to, they want to stay short. Some of them have been bred for putting greens and are used for other things, but they just aren't going to grow up tall. And so, I don't know that I would want to grow those things up to 3, 4, 5 inches because they need to be below 1.5 inches. Okay. Mowing patterns, obviously we've talked about that, and you've got the ability to do that with Bluemuda. You don't have it so much with Bermuda grass. Aerification becomes a little bit trickier because if you aerify in the summertime, like you normally would on a Bermuda grass field, then you're going to hurt your bluegrass. And so that's a tough one. And so what we saw with that was midsummer is not going to make sense, but doing it when neither one of the grasses is stressed out. So like early June, that kind of thing, or, late September, somewhere in that ballpark, you're probably going to have the least amount of damage to your grasses. And obviously aerification is one of those things, depending on your fertility, depending on traffic, those sort of things is probably fairly important. Verticutting can certainly help out, but if you get super aggressive with it, so again, this is a thatch. You're growing two grasses together that both produce thatch, and so managing your thatch through verticutting shallowly, frequently, to kind of thin that out, and top dressing to keep that thatch down is probably going to help you out.
Okay. That was one of the questions posed in chat, so we covered that one. Chemicals. Yeah, this is where I'm completely confused because you're dealing with like cool season and warm season, and obviously you're going to severely limit your arsenal available to you for pest control, I would think, particularly with herbicides, right?
Yeah, this is where it gets tricky. So I did not apply any PGRs to my areas whatsoever, but every turf manager that I've ever spoken to that's growing Bluemuda uses a PGR. Pretty much most of them are using Trinexapac ethyl, but they're using those throughout the entire growing season. And keeping both grasses kind of keeps them tight, keeps them,
Well, when you say growing season, you mean Basically everything
summer.
except for the dead of winter.
Well,
or
basically it's starting in May and stopping in October kind of thing. So maybe letting them grow out of it as you get into fall.
All right.
So, you get the same benefits from a PGR application on Bluemuda as you would on any grass, right? Slower growth, better density, better stress tolerance, all those things.
Mm-hmm.
So I get the question about fungicides a lot. Okay, you've got a disease-resistant grass, Bermuda grass, with a fairly disease-susceptible grass, Kentucky bluegrass. What about your fungicide budget? Is it going to go up from Bermuda grass alone? And the answer to that is not a penny. So
Really?
We saw zero, absolutely zero. In all the years that I did this and all the people that I've talked to, there's been zero disease in Bluemuda.
Really?
And so, yep. So what I think is happening is, so when you've got a dense stand of grass, bunch of, leaves grown together, that disease can move from one plant to the next, and you get disease spreading. Because you've got a Bermuda grass plant beside a bluegrass plant, you've got a susceptible plant that could get diseased, but the plant next to it is not going to get diseased. And so that spread of disease may stop. Or if you do get any disease, it is such a small area of that stand that you don't even see it. And so, there's no doubt the disease is active in these fields, but you don't see it because the Bermuda grass is what you see.
So if we think about the disease triangle, it sounds to me like you're essentially reducing the population of the host.
You're taking the host away. Exactly.
Really? Did you ever plant Bermuda? Like if you have Bluemuda, you had it right next to, say, a control, but did you have just straight Kentucky bluegrass as a control and straight Bermuda grass as a control at any point?
We always had straight Bermuda grass only. Yeah,
okay.
To try and see if this was better than Bermuda on its own.
But not straight Kentucky bluegrass.
No, not straight Kentucky blue.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I wonder what a pathologist would say.
And I know where you're going with that. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Would have been good to have maybe one of those standard bluegrasses like HGT or 365 or whatever on its own to see. Yeah. What does this do?
I mean, if you got if the positive control, basically the Kentucky bluegrass control, got hammered with some disease, and the Bluemuda plots didn't, I mean, that'd be, and we could publish that thing quick. I mean, that would be a really good observation or documentation, because that'd be hard for me to fathom. Like you just get hammered with just straight Kentucky bluegrass, but when it's blended into a Bluemuda system, you don't. That's very interesting to me. I wonder what a pathologist would say about that. Like, it has to be the host, I would think. You're just thinning out the host.
Yeah.
I don't know. Or you're intermixing it with another organism that is not susceptible to that. So you're just reducing the probability of it spreading or something. I don't know what it would be.
That's what I think. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Sorry. I digress.
Anyway, so I like that about it, right? Because if you're growing straight bluegrass, you're going to have to apply fungicide. But if you're applying Bermuda grass, you're not. And so, depending on if you're coming from bluegrass to Bluemuda, your fungicide budget could go down. If you're going from Bermuda to Bluemuda, then it's probably not going to change.
Interesting.
All right. Weed control was a whole different thing though, right? Because you're going to get weeds, whether it's because the grass is getting thinned out from traffic, or if you've got the wrong bluegrass in there, like you saw with that picture with all the annual bluegrass in there, there are going to be things that we need to do. And so, well, like I said, with the right bluegrass, we had such thick bluegrass in the wintertime that we had very little POA pressure.
Okay.
And so we didn't have the light green pops throughout the darker green Kentucky blue.
Okay.
And so the good ones are fairly resistant, but obviously there are some out there that are going to be thinner and let annual bluegrass come on up. And so what we found with that was an application of Exonerate did a pretty good job of taking that annual bluegrass out and letting the Kentucky bluegrass come on. And that label says you can't do that in year one because the Kentucky bluegrass has to be mature.
Okay.
All right. So the other thing I would say with this is to get a good pre-emerge chemical out. Those are really important because if you do get anything thinning out or anything like that, this is going to take care of your broadleaf weeds, your crabgrass, whatever other annual weeds. And so we weren't putting out a fall pre-emerge, and you may think about that. If you want to put out seed to thicken it up, though, obviously a fall pre-emerge is not going to work. A spring pre-emerge, though, you're probably not going to do a ton of seeding in the spring, and so keeping those weeds at bay. The problem is, if you do get weed escape after your pre-emerge application, then what? Because if you look at labels, chemicals are labeled for warm season grasses or cool season grasses, typically not for both. And so the tough thing here is if you apply something for crabgrass control and bluegrass, that chemical could damage Bermuda grass and vice versa. And so that's part of the tricky part here is if you do get some weeds, then what? And so that's why I stress that pre-emerge is so important, because there's not a whole lot of options after that.
Makes sense.
The hope is, though, it's so dense, though, that it's not a problem. But obviously, even if it's super dense, there's weeds can still come up.
So pre-emergent is normally our friend, even in normal turfgrass systems, but in this one, it's imperative that we get on a good pre-emergent program. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can.
Okay, fertility.
Okay.
This is initially you saw that polycoat versus urea trial that we did, but then we got into more and more nuances of what if we put down this, or what are we this much, or when, or whatever. And so there have been a few places that have tried Bluemuda over the years and have failed. Some of them may have been because of where they were located and it was too hot. Some of them may have been because of their management. And so one of them that I know for a fact why they failed was because they fertilized with ammonium sulfate heavily throughout the summertime, and it absolutely just baked out their Kentucky bluegrass. And so they had nothing left, which, not shocking with the salt index on that fertilizer and the burn potential. So that's the first thing that I'd say if you're going to try this is be careful. Think about the bluegrass over the Bermuda grass. And so most of what we did was fall applications, which normally I would say, I've done fall applications. As a matter of fact, you reviewed one of my papers, Travis, that talked about fall fertility of Bermuda grass. And it's not necessarily bad for the plant, but, it's not necessarily great for the plant either. And so, but with cool season grasses, it's the perfect time to fertilize. And so fertilizing most of your fertilizer, 2 to 3 pounds maybe in the fall, and then maybe some slow release as you go through the summertime. That will feed the Bermuda grass that's going along there. And, whatever bluegrass is growing, it's not going to make a surge of growth and make it put that host really into that equation of the disease triangle.
Okay.
So the other interesting thing we saw was actually, can you click the forward?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So this is the same trial as you're seeing here, the picture underneath. This is obviously just from a drone, but this was the amount of fertilizer that we put down at planting. And the dark plots there got 3 pounds of urea, of actual nitrogen from urea, at planting versus 2, 1, or 0. And so we found that really interesting, that high first year fertilizer applications result in thicker, better grass than if you go with less fertilizer.
Okay.
So obviously, something going on there with the growth of the seed and
well, I think that's pretty well established in literature. I mean, early on, when those roots are going, it'll grow in on its own. But if you want to hasten establishment, you were going at rates greater than our normal established turf grass rates. Where it'd be like, half a pound or a quarter pound per growing month or whatever. Now we're talking different rates during establishment. So
yeah,
that's pretty. I think that's
so normally I would never say 3 pounds at one shot, but this this did okay.
Well, I don't know if we'd say 3 pounds of urea at one shot now at all, but we're doing research. We're trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, clearly there's several different things playing in this particular scenario. There's the influence of the plant, the nutrient on the plant, which obviously you're going to grow it in. There's also the cost to do that financially as well as environmentally. And in our world, a BMP has to account for both the financial cost and environmental cost to produce an acceptable sward. So we can produce really, really great looking turf for a lot of money and a lot of environmental cost, or vice versa. And so somewhere in the middle is usually where the BMPs usually fall out. So that 3 pounds of urea, maybe not on our soils in Kentucky, but that's an extremely high environmental risk to go out with that much soluble nitrogen that, but not that you would have a problem, but certainly the risk is greater as opposed to doing it a slow release or lowering that rate. So
for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
And like I showed in that first study, that polycoat, grew in well and add color and all that stuff. And so some slow release source, makes sense. I don't think I'd ever go out with 3 pounds anyways. This is with research, we'd want to do extremes. And I thought for sure 3 pounds was way overboard, but it turned out to be, they were pretty happy.
You don't even want to know stuff. I mean, I've done some crazy stuff, but in research, like I've told my audience before, in order to find the happy Goldilocks BMP zone, we need to know what the max is. What is the maximum amount of nitrogen where the turfgrass will no longer respond to it? Okay, whatever that number is. Then what is the maximum amount of nitrogen whereby the environmental impact exceeds background levels? That's another point. And so we have to account for all these things. And the only way to do that is to get the rate so high that we know where the limit is. And then we start backing it down and so forth. That's how it's done. I just don't want anybody to run away from this and, they're recommending 3 pounds in and Well, no, this is research. Don't forget, guys. Okay.
Right. And if you look at those pictures, there's other dark green plots in there, right? The pound and a half and the 2 pounds, whatever, all of that would have been fine. 3 pounds, I would never, ever say to somebody, go out and apply 3 pounds of nitrogen.
Well, even
soluble nitrogen.
Yeah, even Kale, some of his work, I don't know if it was his PhD or his first paper when he was a professor, he had some stuff in there. He was looking at fall fertility. And he was saying, hey, this is one of the better treatments was this fall fertility at this rate. But then when I had him on, he's like, well, since then we've done some work and we've looked at the environmental consequences and so forth, and he would no longer recommend that. So this is all just a process. It's just that I guess my concern is that the audience isn't always, in the world of research and understands the system or the methodology of working through these kinks in the scientific model. So we're working through it and we're developing the scientific model, but just because you see something doesn't necessarily mean it's included in the BMP when it comes out. So just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So establishment, we've talked about this throughout here this morning, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but again, this is bluegrass, not perennial ryegrass, and it's going to be slower. And it is what it is. And that looks really good. Same field there in the pictures there from November to March. But that's with a lot of love, and not every field, especially this is southern Missouri. That picture was taken where it's going to be warmer transition zone, southern transition zone, and that bluegrass is going to pop earlier than somewhere up in central Kentucky or that location. Blankets can also be used to hasten this. And that's an athletic field phenomena that they've got blankets that they can use to keep grasses growing when the temperatures aren't conducive for growth. But most of us don't have that ability to get that to happen. And so chances are late February like this, you're not going to have a great stand. But by mid-March, it could be looking pretty good. But that first fall, it's going to look like that picture. You're going to have a little bit of bluegrass and a whole bunch of Bermuda grass. Not spectacular. Okay. So we don't need to go overboard with bluegrass. More is not better. And so, most of what we saw was 2.5 pounds was plenty. 2.5 pounds of pure live seed per 1,000 square feet. Plenty of bluegrass to do what you need to do, especially if you can drill that in, vertical mow that in. If you are broadcasting only, maybe higher because you're not going to get every one of those seeds germinating. But drilling and vertical mowing, critical to success on this, getting that seed down into the soil, thinning out that competition from the Bermuda grass. Prepping seed, some people have done some work with this, and practitioners in the field with some pre-germ soaking seed to get it to get going a little bit quicker. But I've never found the benefit to doing all that extra work to be that big of a benefit to me. So I don't know. Some people, if that's your thing, great. But it's just, I don't know how many days are you saving by soaking seed and then drying seed and then, all that stuff.
The amount of effort and labor involved in that too.
More headaches. Yeah. So let's move on to the next one.
Okay.
All right. So this is the slide I'm going to finish up with, but all these things we've talked about, color's great, striping's great. You can see in that golf fairway there, that's not something that you're going to see on Bermuda grass alone. Recovery time, because you've got rhizomes and stolons from Bermuda grass and rhizomes from bluegrass, you've got good recovery when things thin out. Spring cover, sometimes with Bermuda grass alone, you can have some pretty diminished stands, and the bluegrass tends to fill in those voids, and you don't see that. So spring sports can happen with Bluemuda, when sometimes with just Bermuda grass, it's a challenge. Better density, less fungicides, and cheaper than overseeding. I'll say that if you're seeding every year with Bluemuda, it's probably going to be similar. Bluegrass is a little bit more expensive than perennial ryegrass, but you're not putting out as much. You're only putting out 2.5 pounds versus 8, 10, 15, 20 pounds of perennial ryegrass per 1,000 square feet. And you're only doing this hopefully once, and then in some small areas or small amounts afterwards, rather than every year with perennial rye.
So is that the major advantage? So let's imagine there's someone listening to this, and they're in northern Florida or southern Georgia or wherever, and they have Bermuda grass. They've been overseeding with perennial ryegrass every year. Now this comes across their radar, and they're going to ask themselves, well, why would I do this? What's the advantage? Is that the major advantage, is that you don't have to overseed every year with perennial rye if you use the system like this?
Certainly, it's one of the advantages. Like I said, it's kind of a treadmill, right? Where you step on that treadmill by applying the seed in the fall, planting the seed, and then you step off by spraying that grass out in the spring. And every year you're on that same treadmill where you're putting down more and more seed and spraying out, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's all the athletic fields in the south do this. A lot of the big golf courses in the Southwest are, doing the same thing every year. Nothing wrong with that. But Bluemuda is, part of it was getting away from that, because this Brian guy that I mentioned early on was sick of overseeding and then killing. And so he wanted a different solution. And so that was the start of it.
Okay.
But then it grew to, there's a tougher stand. It's better cover at really all times of the year. It's given me color when I didn't have color before, and summer and winter. It's given me these aesthetic benefits that weren't necessarily expected, and so there were the things that came out of it that weren't expected, other than just, can I put this down one time and just be done with it? Okay. And sometimes it's not just one time, depending on how harsh the climate is, how harsh the year is in weather. Grasses die, right?
Yeah,
and so, sometimes you're going to have to seed more into it.
Okay. Was there anything else that on this particular slide that you wanted to,
No. I think we've covered it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's basically what the question I had was, like, what is the hook? So if you're in a system where you're like, man, I'm overseeding every year, I'm buying 10 tons of seed, then 6 months later, I'm spraying it out, and seems like it's just repetitive over and over and over. It seems like I'm putting a lot of resources in it. This system has its challenges. It has its different management practices, but you're not putting in, I don't know what seed is nowadays for perennial rye, $1.50 a pound or $2 a pound, whatever it is a pound. You're not spending 10, 15 grand or whatever it is on all your fairways. You're not spending the money to spray it out. You're spending the money in other areas, but I'm assuming it wouldn't be near to the degree that you would with a perennial ryegrass overseed type system, I guess. So if you're in that boat, that sounds like that's the hook, to get off that hamster wheel and consider of a more of a consistent perennial system that requires a little bit less input.
Now, that said, I think the perennial rye option is the easier option, where it takes less thinking, less skill.
Yeah.
Where it's just, okay, ryegrass, anybody can grow ryegrass, especially in the wintertime. You throw it down and it goes.
Well, I mean, I've used this analogy before. Same thing with fertility programs. I can go buy a bag of fertilizers already blended. It'll do the job. It's probably going to be wasteful to some degree. Like I can buy a house that's already built, or I can buy the tools to build my house. To buy the tools to build my house is going to be more work, but I can get it exactly the way I want it. Whereas I can just go buy a pre-made house and I don't have to worry about any of that, but then I have to live with what I got. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's a very similar sort of situation where probably is easier just to buy the seed and put it out and kill it and spray it out and kill it and da-da-da. But if you're looking...
Well, there's no thinking in that, right? It's just, it's simple. With Bluemuda, you've got to think through the seasons of, if I do this, how is it going to impact the grass that's in the background?
Yeah.
So there's always something else going on.
All right, Greg. Anything else before we close it out in terms of on this? I have a couple questions that have nothing to do with this, but anything else before we go there?
No, yeah, I think, again, Bluemuda, it's not for everybody. It can be super beneficial. I've seen it on fields, literally throughout the world at this point, where it's been extremely successful and people have been very happy with it. And I think it's those turf managers that really want to spend the time on, figuring it out. And every location is slightly different, right? Just because what I saw in Central Kentucky or Missouri worked well for me, yours might be slightly different. And so it's I can give you some tools to start, but then everything is going to be slightly different depending on what gets thrown at it in your location.
I'm going to go through the chat, but it seemed Valeria you had a number of questions, but I believe, Valeria, we've answered a lot of these. Dr. Munshaw has answered these. We talked about the first question you had, vegetative characteristics and what type of density. Dr. Munshaw talked about the density. Is it better to have varieties that are not very aggressive and not very dense? Of course, we talked about that as well. If anything you want to add, Greg, please jump in.
So aggressive bluegrasses are the norm these days. And it's, like I mentioned, that 365 SS, HGT, HT Sports, all three super aggressive grasses, but they all can take that diminished role in the summertime. So they all seem to work.
Okay. It says, how do you measure the transition between seasons, between cool seasons and warm season grasses, scalping, verticutting, these things? You talked a little bit about that. I don't know if you want to go into that in any more detail than you already went in terms of transitioning from, say, going from July, August into September when the Bermuda grass is shutting down. Is there anything particularly special or unique we need to be aware of? And then vice versa in the spring in terms of transitioning?
Spring is pretty easy because that Bermuda grass just wants to come on and get grown, right? As soon as it starts to warm up, it gets going and it starts to get a foothold and continue to thicken up. The bluegrass is much, much slower in the fall. And that's why I said managing your water. If you keep if you spray a PGR across your field or whatever you've got growing, in August, most of the leaves that it's going to be hitting are Bermuda grass. And so you're slowing down the growth of that Bermuda grass. As the temperatures cool down and the bluegrass starts to come on and starts to produce new leaves, new growth, the goal there is ideally not to have as much growth regulation on the bluegrass and have it come on versus the Bermuda grass. And so, you're going to be hitting some bluegrass, obviously, but, really the goal would be to slow the Bermuda grass growth and get the bluegrass to come on.
Okay.
So it's a hard one. And that's one that there was a turf manager in Southern Indiana that had Bluemuda on a soccer field. And this was a national champion soccer university, big time school for soccer. And all their games were on TV. And his issue was the bluegrass just wasn't quick enough to come on in the fall for him to have that perfect TV look.
Okay.
And so he had to go back to ryegrass because, he just couldn't get it to transition because they're out there playing on these fields and stuff. And so watering at different times of the day and that sort of thing just didn't necessarily work for him. And so he ended up getting out of it because of, his situation. Yeah. Spring sports, easy, your field's going to look great in the spring. Fall sports, a little bit trickier.
Okay. Aaron Binkley about Kentucky bluegrass control. We answered that question. Valerio is in central North Italy. He's in Florence, so that might kind of give you an idea where he's coming from in terms of his climate. Says Randy, who's from Bulgaria. He says here in Europe we don't have any hybrid Bermuda grass, only seeded varieties. Any trials with seeded Bermuda grass? I think the answer is yes. Didn't you use Riviera or something? Or
Riviera, yeah. So the two new Bermuda grasses that are out there that are from the same lineage of Riviera is a parent to them are Rio and Monaco. Okay. And I know both are sold in Europe and both are good grasses, good cold tolerance. It's very similar looking to Riviera, but Riviera just didn't produce seed. And so that company that owns it just got out of it.
Okay. So someone in Europe would be looking at Monaco and what was the other one? Rio. Okay.
Yeah.
Those are the ones okay. Any other questions? Says, what about seeding Bermuda into Kentucky bluegrass? I think you were fidgeting with some of that stuff when this whole thing shut down here, weren't you?
Yeah. We, so that's been done. And I when Dr. Shaddox and I talked about this, I didn't want to give a full 75 slide presentation, and I've got slides of where we've done it both ways. And it's more challenging to take a stand of bluegrass and get seeded Bermuda grass up into it. And part of that is because seeded Bermuda grasses, once they're up and growing, are great and strong growers and aggressive. But as seed and seedlings, they're weak. And so one of the things that when I was a professor at Mississippi State University back in the dark ages, I worked with converting old common Bermuda grass fairways to new seeded varieties. How do you do that? And essentially we had, we tried everything. We tried PGRs, we tried vertical mowing, we tried scalping, we tried, anything that we could come up with to thin out these common Bermuda grasses and try and get some of the seeded varieties to come in. And nothing worked other than a glyphosate application. So just basically killing it. And so what we learned from that was seeded Bermuda grasses, if there's any competition for them whatsoever, they're going to just kind of sit there and fizzle out. And so if you do this with a seeded Bermuda grass, you got to make sure that I get a PGR on that bluegrass to have it slow down. And you're going to be seeding, depending on if you're northern hemisphere, you're going to be seeding very likely in late spring as the temperatures start to warm up that are conducive to Bermuda grass growth. So slow down the bluegrass, thin it out with vertical mowing, and then you're going to try and baby get the seedlings going, right? You got to get the seed soil contact. So ideally drilling in a couple of different directions would be ideal, but it's still because of the bluegrass there. It's still, if there's any competition whatsoever, the bluegrass will win. The more, it's a tough one. Even as the bluegrass is slowing down as you go into the summer, it's still a tough one. People have tried sprigging, not seeding, but sprigging Bermuda grass in, and that works. Both will work, but you've got to be diligent and baby the Bermuda grass.
Good to know. I didn't realize that. Yeah. All right, last two questions. If I asked your peers the following question, what do you think they would say? Dr. Munshaw is known as a specialist in turfgrass science in what area? What are you good at? What do you think your peers would say in turfgrass?
I thought about that recently. What do I do? As a PhD student, I was a plant physiologist, so I learned all about the inner workings of plants and understood how things worked, how things were broken down in a plant, all that stuff really well. And then as I got out, my first job was primarily teaching and research. And so my research brain transitioned into a learn how to teach brain. And then I moved into extension, which is basically consulting kind of thing at the University of Kentucky. And so extension and research. So still all the while a little bit of research, but I think I don't know, Travis, that's hard. My superpower, I think, is, and you may not guess it from today, but I can communicate fairly complex topics at a level that most people can understand. Okay. And so I wouldn't necessarily call myself a spectacular turfgrass scientist or anything along those lines, but I think I can take things that either I've learned or other people have learned and boil them down for something for me to understand. And so I can communicate with either lay people or people that don't have PhDs.
Okay. In your yard, not your research, but in your yard, what grass do you have and what quality rating would you give it?
Good question. So I have tall fescue, and this was just, I didn't plant it. It was here when we moved in. And there's some bluegrass here and there that, again, I'm guessing they either sodded fescue bluegrass or they seeded. I don't know what they did, but, and there's Kentucky 31 as you move out away from the house. And so anyways,
so a mix.
It's a mix, but I don't do maintenance. I mow it at 4 inches, which is the perfect mowing height for a lawn. And I bring on the comments. And I will rarely fertilize. I'll fertilize if I see the color going off, but otherwise I don't see the value in fertilizing and paying for fertilizer. And so I would give my lawn probably a 7 out of 9.
Okay. That's pretty good.
On an NTEP scale.
It's better than mine.
It's right. So we've had plenty of rain.
Yeah.
And so it's green and growing.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much for your time. I know you're very busy, and I've been wanting to get you on here for a while, and appreciate it. I learned quite a bit already. So this is, as you know, you were the plant guy. I was the soil guy. It kind of worked out. We didn't step on each other's toes, and we complemented each other very well here. And I fully admit I don't know a whole lot about the actual details of the plant. I'm more of a soils person. So
and vice versa. Yeah.
It was nice hearing this today. For those listening, I'll be back on Thursday. I can't get here on Tuesday. I know I said I would try to do it, but Thursday night I'll be going over fertilizer formulations. Please bring your calculator if you want to participate. It's going to be some math involved. Appreciate everybody in the chat. Thank you very much. Dr. Munshaw, just hang on, run real quick. Let's don't hang up. Just stay where you're at. For everybody else, thank you all for being here. Thank you all, Dr. Munshaw, for being here. I'll see you on Thursday night. Thank you.